Okay, John Cleese. So most of this comes from John Cleese's autobiography, which is entitled So Anyway, which was released in 2014. It's well written and funny. Well, he's a writer and a Cambridge graduate and a comedian, so I suppose that's to be expected. He was an only child, and there was a name change because John's dad, Reg, changed his name from Cheese to Cleese. John writes, the subterfuge allowed him to join the carnage in France. This was the First World War, albeit under an assumed name. He was fed up being teased that he was a fermented curd, so he changed the H to an L. I never understood what he was hoping to achieve. I was always called Cheese from the moment I arrived at school. There's a lot of emphasis on school in this book. I'm amazed by Cleese's almost total recall. There are lots of stories about primary school and prep school and public school and university as well. Stories about the different masters, often in fine detail. There's much more of his school days than there is of his days with the Pythons. I can remember very little from school. Maybe it's repressed memories from the trauma. Side note, I also read Bruce Dern's autobiography recently, and so much of that was about his high school cross country running career rather than being about his acting career. But that's not to say that it wasn't interesting. Cleese is very good in terms of psychology, and he seems to have done a lot of reading on this topic. He's self taught and he quotes a variety of psychologists such as Abraham Maslow, Maurice Nichol, and he even co authored a book with psychiatrist Robin Skinner called Families and How to Survive Them, which was released in 1983. So, on the subject of families, John didn't get on very well with his mum. He explains at length that she was difficult, highly strung, anxious, sometimes bad tempered, and self obsessed. So, there was obviously some mental health issues there. Uh, when Cleese was young, he got on very well with his dad, and he was very close to his dad, who was kind of an English Edwardian gentleman. Though Cleese repeatedly points out that his father was barely middle class. He was an insurance salesman. Cleese moved frequently as a child and lived in lots of places around the southwest of England, and at times his parents didn't get on very well. The book has plenty of interesting asides related to psychology. For example, he writes, research has shown that constant relocation in childhood is often associated with creativity. It seems the creative impulse is sparked by the need to reconcile contrasting views of the world. Cleese goes on to write, so creatively, I was doubly blessed. Constant relocation and parental disharmony. Regarding an incident when he hid Graham Chapman's pipe as a joke, and Chapman kneed him in the balls after Cleese confessed. He writes, I realized I was slightly in shock, so I sat down slowly and carefully, but my mind was already casting around for possible explanations. Suddenly, a Freudian one became obvious. I had not taken his pipe, I had stolen his penis. Okay, next anecdote. First love, and this was at university, unrequited and terrifying. He writes, I was fearful that I would embarrass the object of my affections by suggesting a course of action which she might experience as alarming, distasteful, or downright repellent. This punctilious concern not to offend or distress was, I'm sure, the camouflage that my unconscious employed to hide from myself my deep fear of rejection. For some time, therefore, I wandered around in a mooncalf dream, falling further and further behind in my work, scared, frozen, and wonderfully unhappy. So he's very good at analyzing his own psychology. After reading this passage, I thought, what's a mooncalf? And I had to look it up. And it's a great word, and it's very descriptive. Is mooncalf, and it means fool. Mooncalf is the perfect word for describing the young romantic fool, I think. But he gets over this unrequited love, and he later writes, I was able to return to Cambridge that autumn and settle into the easiest and most convenient of routines. A couple of law lectures, a stroll back to Diggs, a bit of study, round the corner to the Footlights Club room for a cheap lunch, a cheerful chat with other members, back to Diggs, write an essay, take a break, dinner, wander back to Diggs. A couple of hours of study, and over to the club room again for 2 packets of cheese and onion crisps and a couple of pineapple juices with the most relaxed, good natured, and funny guys in the whole university. How conscientious and good natured is John Cleese. When I think back to the debauchery and sloth of my own university days, I just cringe and curl into the fetal position. Next is the class system. Cleese is very good about the minutiae of the English class system. Discussing class divisions at Cambridge, he writes, the only slight awkwardness that existed between the classes seemed to be between the public school boys and the grammar school boys. The latter were just as bright, but the fact that their parents had not had to pay school fees drew attention to the fact that they came from less affluent homes and they could seem a little ill at ease socially. As I got to know them, they all told me the same thing, that most public schoolboys had a confidence that they felt they lacked, and so, in social situations, they often felt ill at ease. They wondered how the public school chaps had acquired their sense of self assurance, and I certainly couldn't tell them. I guess that some people took their position in the social hierarchy so seriously it made them feel superior and act accordingly. This certainly still exists, I think. Later, Cleese writes, you see, in the early 1960s, Britain was so ridden with class distinction that it coloured every aspect of life, though generally in an unspoken way. Take money, for example. In the 1960s, money was, well, vulgar. At least to talk about it was vulgar. And any blatant attempt to acquire large quantities of it was crude and aesthetically offensive. My friend Tony J once summed it up. It was alright to have money, it was just getting it that was vulgar. That's maybe less the case now, so much of the old money is gone. Cleese also writes, in my entire 3 years at Cambridge, I met only one undergraduate who intended to enter the world of business. It was fascinating to see how the aristocratic attitude to trade had infected the public schools and even brainwashed little plebeian gits like me. This is very perceptive, I think. And this was still the case when I went to university. Some people were naive and snobbish about business and trade. A lot of people just wanted stature and an easy job in some institution. Christ, we were complacent. We should have been more entrepreneurial. Regarding David Frost, Cleese writes, added to his social skills, which were considerable, this all made him a remarkably able man of affairs, but his skills and talent were not those taught or valued much by Oxbridge types who felt their ability to write clever essays on Yeats or Walter Bagehot should have earned them greater prestige and money. Their cultural perspective prevented them from recognizing David's strengths. David Frost is mentioned a lot in the book with much affection and admiration. He was a key figure in Cleese's career and gave him many opportunities as a writer and a performer. So Cleese is good at articulating the kind of silly snobbery of elite British institutions and the upper classes. All right, comedy. In his comedy, Cleese is great at satirizing authority figures, the English middle and upper classes, uh, and also male anger. That's key to his humor, which he sends up so well in the character Basil Fawlty from Fawlty Towers. Cleese emphasizes the ludicrous nature of male anger. It's righteous and indignant, but it's often at the same time precious and ineffectual. In the book, Cleese suggests that in his comedy, he's making light of things that actually scare him, such as anger and violence. In the comedy sketch, anger becomes ridiculous and ineffectual, and violence becomes slapstick. So there's a relief there in the comedy. More recently, we can see more great satire of male anger in performers like Will Ferrell or Adam Sandler. Cleese writes, when James Thurber described humour as emotional chaos remembered in tranquility, he was only pointing out that things that seem very important at the time usually aren't. In fact, it's rightly considered healthy to be able to laugh at oneself, and we all much prefer people who do not take themselves too seriously. People who are uncomfortable around humour are either pompous, inflated, or neurotic, oversensitive. That's a good quote there from James Thurber that Cleese references. Although Cleese's comedy does send up authority figures in the upper classes, at the same time he admired and respected his father and some of his teachers for their Edwardian decorum. We're going way back here because Cleese's father was born in 1893. In the book, Cleese writes, this was the Edwardian gentleman's approach to life: courtesy, grace, restraint, the careful avoidance of embarrassing others, non intrusiveness, considerateness, kindness, modesty. Nay, more than modesty, self effacement. But the charm of it all was that there was humour and indeed a hint of playfulness about his constant state of being appalled. And he was not often deeply appalled. Sometimes he was only slightly appalled. For example, at our stupidity, of which there was a lot about. Here he's talking about a teacher that he had when he was at school. Um, Unfortunately, there are not many Edwardian gentlemen left about nowadays, or people that have those values or characteristics. But this notion of the Edwardian gentleman is what they sell in lots of British movies or even Hollywood movies with British leading men, or on programs like Downton Abbey or The Crown, neither of which I've watched, so I'm reaching a bit there. Um, but so there you go. I also admire Edwardian gentlemen, but there are not a lot around anymore. That's it for this episode of Anecdotal Evidence.